One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Welcome to SKYLIT Bookstore's podcast. We are so excited you guys are here today. I'm your host, Christine Blackburn, and I will be here today in conversation with Laura Creste and also Emma Hine, and we're celebrating Emma Hine's new book, Stay Safe. So I'm basically going to let the girls speak in conversation. There'll be some questions asked, I'm sure, from Laura, and we'll get a lot more information about the new book. It's a brand new debut collection of poetry that is just doing fantastic, and we're so happy to have her book here at SKYLIT Books. So if you guys have a chance, you make sure you head over to skylitbooks.com and order Emma Hine's new book, Stay Safe. And there's always stuff on our website telling you what's coming up, our virtual events, and more information about our podcasts. You can also follow SKYLIT Bookstore at SKYLIT Books on Twitter. That's where we like to hang out. So come on over to Twitter and follow SKYLIT Books. All right, you guys, we're so happy to have Emma Hine here. She is originally from Austin, Texas, and she received a BA from Washington University in St. Louis and an MFA from New York University. She currently serves as the communication manager at the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses and the education content specialist at the Academy of American Poets. Hine's poems have previously appeared or are forthcoming in 32 Poems, Arts and Letters, Copper Nickel, Gulf Coast, the Mississippi Review, Ninth Letter, The Offing, the Paris Review, Painted Bride Quarterly, Radar Poetry, and the Southern Review. And like I said, she'll be in conversation today with Laura Creste, who won a 2019 Poetry Society of America's Chapbook Fellowship for her book of poetry called You Should Feel Bad. So please, folks, enjoy this conversation with Laura Creste and Emma Hine.
Thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here, and I am a huge fan of SKYLIT Books and also of Laura's work, so this is a real honor. I was just going to start by reading a couple of poems from Stay Safe. And this first poem is called A Circling. Impossible to think of Frank and not think shark. His bathrobe flopped open once, and there it was, bite of thigh missing, skin like a spider tried to stop the hole with web. I never looked at him directly again. My mother fixed him lunch while I stared anywhere but the carved space that was the scar that was Frank. He was my great uncle. In the family story, his father tells him not to take a swim. The shark net is down. Everyone knows not to swim without the net. He dives from the cliff. From the air, a fin. His flesh unlaces. There are teeth embedded in his bone. By the time he died, I'd memorized his shape in the recliner, the pattern of beer bottles across his floor, mapping his aftermath like a frontier. The shark hovers inches above its own shadow. Frank pulls off his clothes in the sun. The second poem I'm going to read is called Incantation for If and When I Lose Him. He makes a good decommissioned warship. I make a good ocean. Good tugboat leading him far enough from the shore. Good explosive fixed in rows below the waterline of his hull. This series of hollow booms is our last slow dance. When I have flooded all his rooms, the empty bunks, the engine stripped of its wires, let his portholes fill and fall like plunder. Let him stay where I sink him. Let the fish come. Let the coral turn this wreck and tender into something new. And I'll just read one final poem. It's called Longview. The old motel is still there in the dunes, and the oil rig still flickers like a deserted city on the horizon. When we check in, the receptionist says that long ago, a woman swam all the way to the rig from shore. Someone else told us this story when we were children. The empty city doesn't give up its first inhabitant easily, so like grief, the swimmer has to settle in. She scales the derrick, tears her clothes into strips and ties them to the cables, presses her face against the warm engine's side. It's getting late, but we leave our bags in the room and follow the boardwalk to the beach, where the waves touch shore in little habitual apologies, and the sand holds our footprints like it's never been walked on before. We play our old game, count the lights, the moon, the safety beams on the oil rig, swath of galaxy, phosphorescing shrimp. The beach is so bright, it could be day on a different planet, a dimmer one farther from the sun, making us very far away, looking around at an array of distant lights and signaling straight for the small blue earth. Do not miss us, we say, and we're sorry. Sorry we left at night with no note or explanation. You see, we always intended to come back.
Oh, Emma, you read some of my favorite poems. So I loved hearing those. I'm a little torn right now because I want to ask you about space because of the last poem you just read, but I also want to ask you about family because of the Frank poem. So I think let's start with family and then move on to space later.
That sounds great.
Yeah, so many of these poems circle around like stories that get passed down through families. I was just wondering, how do you negotiate which stories are okay to tell or sift through which version is the truest? Because you make references to like different people's perspectives, like in Flight Path, they argued and added until each girl had a list of her own. Or you'll talk about my version of the stories, or when Frank appears in another poem, it's his, my cousin once removed told stories about her father, and in every story he was a different kind of man. Just how do you balance all of these different perspectives and honoring other people's perspectives, but still having the authority of the storyteller and like you were telling us the one true version?
I love that question, and it's definitely something that I've wrestled with during all of my revisions of this collection. I used to really stay away from family stories because I didn't want to feel like I was telling someone else's story or telling someone else's secrets. And I remember one time something happened to a family member and another family member told me explicitly, this is not your story to tell. And I held on to that for a while. But I think what I'm starting to realize is that when you care about people and when you hold their stories, they become your stories too. So for me, I think wrestling with the idea of perspective and really trying to negotiate the fact that the same event can be told by multiple different people in multiple different ways, and treating that with as much kindness and nuance and compassion as possible was the way I tried to address family history in this collection. But I was very relieved when I gave this book to my extended family, and they met it with a lot of grace and celebration, because I was nervous about having told some family stories that are true and some family stories in this collection that are pure fiction that I just said were family stories. So I think, yeah, negotiating truth and fiction and acknowledging them in interesting ways was just the way I personally chose to address it.
And do you ever show your poems to maybe your immediate family? Like you write so much about your sisters. Do you show them drafts in progress, or do you wait until the end?
It depends on the poem. There's a poem in Stay Safe called This Time that's about a horse. Something terrible happens to a horse. And that is pretty close to the truth. And I did run that poem by the sister that it happened to, just to make sure that that I was doing the event justice and not treading on any toes. But sometimes I just wait and they read it when it's published.
Yeah, that one is such a startling poem. Trying to think, I feel like there's also some distance you create with your real life and the characters in your book, because you do use those radio names, like the Hotel Sisters, I think helps create some of that distance.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I definitely did that on purpose so that I felt like I could, it's kind of that I am not the speaker of my poem. My sisters are not the sisters of my poems, even though there's a huge amount of consistency there, of course, between reality and the world of the poems. It was very helpful to me to have these stand-in sisters for my sisters that are kind of literal like radio echoes of my actual sisters. I felt like I could make dramatic moments more dramatic and not feel like I was kind of sensationalizing our lives. But yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. When I was in grad school, I did something similar with writing about my family, where I changed their names in a project I've since given up on. But yeah, so I can really relate to that impulse of obscuring the truth just a little bit so you can sneak in more family detail and more personal stuff.
Yeah.
I also noticed that when you're writing about other people's lives, you'll sort of do this thing where you'll pull back a little bit at a very vulnerable moment and leave some of the action implied, even though it's still very, the descriptions are incredibly vivid, and you don't shy away from telling us what's happening in the larger scene, but in the moment of like death, for example, and mentioning how a great grandfather was a pilot who died in a plane crash, the moment of his death is given some privacy because that's conveyed with just I'm gonna find it, maybe we can cut out some of these pauses. Our great grandfather was a test pilot, we don't know much, and then it starts speculating about how the plane might have failed, but the we don't know much is how his death is communicated. So I was just wondering if that kind of spareness is something that you revise towards, or if that is naturally how you come at these stories that you don't have firsthand knowledge of.
It really depends. I think I revise toward rhythm in a lot of cases. For instance, that poem that you just read from, it started as a very in-depth lyric essay where I was really trying to go into the narrative of my great-grandfather's death. And I had newspaper clippings and I was trying to write around it, and it felt a little bit laden and it felt a little bit boring. And I was having trouble figuring out how to make it more immediate. And I did two things. I added there's a separate narrative in there. There's a fable of two girls on the beach. And I added that. And I also tried to revise the poem itself toward really punchy sentences to keep myself as a reader invested in the way it was moving. So I think often if I feel myself getting too long-winded in a scene, I try to sort of punch it up into shorter sentences and move the poem more quickly through drama. But I think I might also be looking away from things that upset me too. I've learned that is a tendency of my own in poems that I'm interested in. I look forward to exploring in the future, but I definitely think I'll be like, oh, this is about to get bloody, let's go fast.
That makes sense. But yeah, I love that poem, Flight Path, and it's so interesting to know that it used to be a lyric essay, because there are moments that are quite prosy, especially section 6, which extends the farthest across the page.
Yes.
Yeah, and I feel like this poem is a good example of two different things that you do, where you will be very like technical, like you're describing flight in this incredible detail that seems to me like you've done a lot of research on how planes work, but then you also have running alongside that this sort of mythic or like fable happening about girls finding a man washed up on the shore with his skin is clear and you can see his insides, and then he gets up and he walks away. How do you how did you figure out that like these two different impulses can exist within just the same book and even within the same poem? Because to me, it seems like you're like finding the world explicable in a way, like you can do the research and understand it, but then you hit a limit where it just becomes too mysterious, and that's where the magic has to step in.
Oh, I love that description. I think I get excited about different kind of kinds of writing or different ways of thinking at different times. And in that poem in particular, and throughout the book, it really helped me to alternate. And so the section that you're talking about that goes really technically into the mechanics of flight, I spent a long time sitting with newspaper clippings, and I also found this really cool old book that was like a visual dictionary of old aircraft from World War I. And so I was researching really meticulously the tiny micro ways in which these technologies worked. But then I would kind of peter out, and I would get tired, or I would feel like I'd emotionally exhausted like what I could get out of that part of the poem, and I would switch, and I would be able to take the emotions that I'd been trying to figure out and develop in the more technical parts and really expand them in these fables that I was using to try to illustrate those same emotions in different ways. And I did that in other poems too. There are some very kind of mythic, fabulous poems in here. And then there are others that required a lot of research. One of the poems that I read just a minute ago, actually, Incantation for If and When I Lose Him, that one I did a huge amount of research on what happens when a boat is sunk to make a coral reef. And so I feel like, I guess it's just the same as some writers switch genres and use that genre switching as energizing. I found it really energizing to do research and then go full fairy tale. And I was able to kind of bounce back and forth.
Yeah. Do you remember which impulse came first for that poem, Incantation for If and When I Lose Him? If it was the image that you had first and then you did the research to support it, or if you were reading about this, how the reef is made, and then you were suddenly like, this is kind of like love. Like,
I'm pretty sure it was the reef. I think I got really into just some of those, like that underwater photography that you see sometimes of, old like tanks and stuff that have sunk and have the coral built up around them. And then I started thinking, oh, a breakup.
Naturally.
Yeah.
Yeah, were you read a lot of like mythology too as a child, or a lot of fairy tales? It seems like that is running so strongly through your work. Is that just like ingrained in you from a young age?
Yeah, we had that classic book of myths that a lot of people have. And actually, I lost my childhood copy, and I ended up with Sharon Olds' copy when, while she was teaching at NYU, she was giving away copies or books from her personal library that she didn't have space for anymore. And I ended up with hers, which just felt beautifully poetic. But we read a lot of myths. And then as a kid, I got really into like mythical retellings of Robin Hood and Beauty and the Beast and stuff like that. But my family just really lives in storytelling. I think the way our dinner table conversations growing up were like, Mom, tell us that story about the time my uncle did that weird thing. And I think that really informed my understanding of the way we sit in our own family narratives,
That makes sense. I mean, you have a lot of good family stories, so I can see why you'd want to hear them. And then you can really see Bridget Begin Kelly's influence on some of these poems, especially the one, Selkie, which you explicitly say is after her. Can you talk a little bit about the creation of that poem?
Yes, that was one of those poems that I fully wrote as a different poem first. It was a poem about my mom going on a hike on the beach and getting a little bit lost, and there wasn't a Selkie in it. And it just didn't quite work. And I worked on it for a really long time, and I'd never read Bridget Begin Kelly. And then I started reading her work, and it was just transformative. You have those experiences sometimes when you pick up a poet that you've never encountered before, and it just like you start seeing in color all of a sudden, and her work was like that for me. And I know she's like that for a lot of poets I really admire. and I came across her poem, The Black Swan, and I couldn't get the structure and the syntax of that poem out of my head. And I ended up kind of doing an imitation exercise, basically, where I took the ideas and the emotions in that original poem about my mother on the beach, and I combined them with the Selkie myth, and I put them in a format that echoed Kelly's poem, and it finally started to work. And that was actually a really transformative moment just in my editing process. I feel like it was only after that that poems like Flight Path finally started to take shape in the way they appear now. I feel like I needed her poems, and I needed her relationship to family and myth to be able to approach my own in a way that felt right, I guess, at that point.
I remember I was introduced to her poems by you at some point in grad school, and I was like, oh, this makes sense. This makes sense. This is one of Emma's favorite poets. And yeah, she's phenomenal. Should we talk about space?
I would love to talk about space.
There are a few poems in this book that take place in space, or like in Red Planet is a persona poem, like, from Mars's perspective, which I love. And then there's just the incredible Echo Hotel, which I just think of as like a poem that really anchors the whole collection. And then, just interesting side note, you have another project going that takes up this same world. So can you talk about what is it about space that you find so generative? Like I know you have an abiding love for sci-fi. So can you talk about that a little?
I love science fiction, to be like you said, I love science fiction. And I think for a long time, I grew up on Star Trek. I grew up really loving to I wanted to be an astronaut before I realized that, do I have the math brain? No. Do I get terrible motion sickness? Yes. But I love just thinking about what's out there and thinking about space and possibility. And I think for me, space and the ocean play similar roles, especially in my poetry and in the way I think about this sort of thing, this flat depth, that can hold really wonderful things and really terrifying depth. And I think they kind of play two ends of the same spectrum, both in Stay Safe and in my mind. But I didn't think that space was something you could really write about. In my mind, that was my kind of wonderful guilty pleasure, and it was a subgenre, and it wasn't something that you could put in poetry. And then I read Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars, and then I read Adrian Matika's Map to the Stars, and a few other books that address space. Bianca Stone's Someone Else's Wedding Vows has a really gorgeous poem about Star Trek Voyager in it. These poems that address space, and I started to feel like I was allowed to think in this sort of way, and it was incredibly energizing, I think, to be able to take this whole genre that just to me really sums up like possibility and creativity and inventiveness, and also like darkness and fear, and put it into poetry in a way I didn't think it belonged before. And that kind of juxtaposition just gave me a lot of energy.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, you say in another poem too, surely space is just another underwater.
Yes.
I love, because they're equally unknown and mysterious.
Right. They're both really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. So then how did the novel happen?
So you mentioned the long poem in Stay Safe. It's called Echo Hotel, and it's a series of prose poems that are all set in the same science fiction universe. They're all set on this kind of fleet of generations ships that have left Earth some long ago, time before. And that was the last poem that I wrote for this collection before it was accepted. And while I was sending Stay Safe out to publishers and then working on it with my wonderful editor at Saraband, I needed something to do, and I just didn't feel like I was done with that world. So I started just playing around in it, working on kind of fictional stories set in that same world. And I have some very lovely friends who serve as readers, and they're sort of a group of fiction writers and poets who are very generous, and of whom Laura is actually one, who are very kind and helped me workshop and think about these ideas. And I guess I couldn't let go of the world, and now it's a novel. I'm working with an agent on it right now, which is very exciting.
Yeah, it's a great novel. I'm so happy that you've continued that project. The world feels so lived in this poem, like just in the small details, like uh, the librarian who's reading a book, like the audiobook, it says, has the soft accent of someone only a generation or two removed from Earth. And it's just those little details that make it feel so alive to me.
Thank you.
I have a theory about why you love writing about space.
Yes.
Which maybe it's not that much of a stretch because you pretty much allude to it in one of the poems here, but just talking about like writing about space or people who are cast off in space and removed from Earth is a good device to have all of your characters experiencing this sort of diffuse like grief and anxiety, and it's this just like shared collective trauma. Like there's a line in that prose poem we've been talking about, Echo Hotel, with all were careful not to cast it as a home abandoned. So you took a while to define this feeling you were born with as grief. When you finally did, you told your parents there was a hole in your chest the size of a planet.
That makes so much sense. I had never thought about it in that context before, but I think you're absolutely right. And I did have a friend who read this poem tell me once that it was the most nature-y poem about space they'd ever read. And I do think that I tend toward nature in all of my poems, and I find it almost a useful exercise to have to leave dirt and plants behind so dramatically as to go to space.
Yeah, and it feels like an elegy for the Earth. Like it's just this really intense longing that many of the characters share. So
yeah, no, I think you're totally right.
Can we talk about anxiety?
Absolutely.
Because that's another thing that partly comes up in the space poems, but also in other poems. Your speakers are often very anxious or like grieving or just feeling a lot of intense dread. And I was wondering, basically, when thinking about like anxiety and terrible things that can happen, like one of your speakers says that like fears come alive in the speaking of them, so you should avoid bringing up your deepest fears because it might like invite them to happen. But then you sort of do the opposite throughout this whole book. Like there's a moment where you say, I can only imagine this kind of grief, and I do. And I love the frankness of that, just I do. So yeah, how do you feel about like the push and pull of like avoiding anxiety, but like writing into your deepest fears? And yeah, what does that look like as you're writing it?
So I'm very anxious, and working on these poems really helped me name and explore some of these anxieties. I try to stay away from the idea of writing as therapy, but I think that the act of communicating, even if it's just to yourself, the way that you feel and navigate those feelings is incredibly helpful in some ways. Like I say in that poem, about, kind of thinking ahead toward grief and wondering what grief will be the one that fells you. I've actually had a very lucky life, but I have a lot of what they call anticipatory grief. I spend a lot of time being anxious in advance about that. And so I'm trying to play with that with the title Stay Safe as well. But I don't know, I think that it was a really long process for me learning how to engage with my own anxiety in a way that didn't feel navel-gazy, I guess, in a way that to me felt interesting and productive, but not too intensely and individually personal. And actually, an early draft of this book was almost entirely poems about a modern day Cassandra figure, who, Cassandra as the mythic figure who was cursed to know the future but never be believed. And I think I used that as a way to kind of negotiate talking about anxiety in a way that didn't feel too personal. And it let me think about and explore some of these ideas without feeling like I was betraying my own confidence or talking about myself too much. And I had a full draft of that book, but it just didn't feel right. And I ended up revising most of those poems or harvesting from them and using them in this collection. So little bits of them are here. So it's sort of, I think it, or at least I hope, that a lot of the poems still have that sense of a speaker, kind of like a doomed prophet talking about the future and not really able to stop what she knows is going to happen. But I hope at least that that's just moved back into an anxious speaker and isn't a cursed princess anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't think it's too navel-gazy. I think that applies to most of us, or I found this like extremely relatable, especially in lines like, I'm still in the part of my life before the loss I won't get over, and when will it be, and who? Like that's, coming for everybody who lives long enough. So I found it comforting to have poems that directly engage with that idea.
Thank you. And I want to take a moment just to plug your book as well. Your poems are just also really kind of gorgeous, contemporary, kind of thought-provoking looks at kind of anxiety and modernity and what it's like to live in the world and live in a relationship and be a writer and a reader in this time. And so I feel like your poems actually make me feel the same way. I love sitting with them, and I feel like I always learn something more about myself as a reader when I do.
Oh, well, thank you. I think we're good readers for each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But back to your book. Could you talk about the title? Like, how weird did it feel? Like you sent it out with the title, a couple of years ago at 2019, 2018, and now it was published in January of 2021. And you've been hearing "stay safe" constantly, like signing off with email signatures and people just like saying it to each other all the time. How did that feel?
It's so weird. It is so weird to see my book title on Walgreens marquees and interstate signs. And, I like, you go into any store and there's a big sign that says "stay safe." I find it very strange. I chose it because it felt familiar, but at the time, in like late 2018, when this was the title I landed on, it didn't feel overused. It was really something that I remember telling it to a friend, and he said, that sounds like something a Southern parent would say, but he wasn't familiar with it or overly familiar with it outside of that context. And now it's just become like the catchphrase of our lives. No, it's very strange. And I think, I don't know, it feels, as back to anxiety, as an anxious person, I've always felt, right, like we were living in this world, and I know I'm not alone in this, where you tell people to stay safe because there's something big and scary coming. And then just in this particular case, the big scary thing came, and it was this fully tragic and life-changing year that has just caused so much loss and so much heartbreak. And I think in a way I don't feel guilty per se, but I feel like I've got this title that now is always going to be related in my mind to all of this loss that the book itself doesn't actually speak to. And I wish I could have some sort of, second dedication or something that spoke to the fact that I have a title that accidentally gestures just to international heartbreak. But it was done and set before I knew that was going to happen, before any of us knew that was going to happen.
Well, I prefer to think of it as you being Cassandra-like.
Yes. Actually, that is funny.
And it is like, yeah, just heartbreaking because it's this thing you say as a gesture of like, I care about you. I hope you're all right. But it's this like declarative, imperative statement that doesn't accomplish anything. Like have a safe flight, like as if you have any control over that. So I just find it, an effective and kind of heartbreaking title.
Thank you.
And yeah, things have changed a lot for you in the last year with the pandemic. You've moved a few times, and are you in your childhood home right now with all those boxes behind you?
I am. This is my last weekend ever in my childhood home. My parents moved into this house when my mom was 29, and so they're leaving. I've been here to help them pack up, and I've been thinking a lot about, there are a lot of houses and there's a lot of moving in Stay Safe, and it's strange to be living that out on the other side and thinking about the locations in which stories were told not being ours anymore. It's very strange.
Yeah, and you've been living out of a van, which I think is very romantic and also complicated.
Yes, I have. I've been, my fiance and I moved into a camper van right before the pandemic started, so it's been a strange year. Yeah, so.
And yeah, so how, just like, since sense of place is so important in your poems, and your childhood home playing a big role in the book and moving around, how do you think your poems, like that you're either writing now or will change in response to having moved? Like, you were in New York for a number of years and now you've left New York and you're on the road. And are you writing New York poems? Are you writing Texas poems?
I think I'm actually in that category of writers who are having trouble writing poems this year. And I know some writers, including you, I'm loving your new work. And I'm excited to see what happens down the road. I think I'm hoping that I end up writing new poems. I found that I always need a little time to percolate. A lot of these Texas poems I wrote in New York. So maybe my New York poems will happen down the road. But I do feel like I'm starting to kind of fill up the bank a little bit again. And I think that moving around is really helping. I'm excited to see, trepidatious, to see what kind of where all of the moving and all of the anxiety and kind of displacement of this past year, kind of how those work out into future poems of my own, and also in poets that I admire. I feel like the poetry collections coming out 4 to 5 years from now are going to be awesome, as we're all trying to kind of grapple with the strangeness of the past year. I'm really excited to read all of them.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see all of your new poems. Send me them when you have them.
Same to you, please.
And thanks for indulging all of my questions. This was really great to hear just a deep dive on what your perspective was about having published these.
Well, thank you for your questions, and thank you again to SKYLIT Books. This was just a real honor.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You guys are so good. I'm telling you, I've really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much, Emma Hine, and thank you, Laura Creste. This was just great. And we want to thank you, the audience, you guys. We appreciate you tuning in to SKYLIT Podcasts. And remember that you can purchase Emma's books, Stay Safe, at skylitbooks.com. And we appreciate you shopping at SKYLIT Bookstore, your favorite neighborhood bookstore, even if you don't live here. Okay, you guys, one more time on behalf of the very talented Emma Hine and Laura Creste, thank you both so much. My name is Christine Blackburn. Thanks for listening to SKYLIT Books Podcast. Read on.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see